Auburn versus Alabama college football pick Saturday. Auburn improved to 5-6 with their 41-17 home win to Western Kentucky. Tigers produced 374 yards with 252 rushing on 42 attempts. Defensively, they held WKU to under 3 yards per rush with 300 passing yards on 59 attempts. Robbie Ashford completed 42% of his passes with 5.4 yards per attempt. On the year, Ashford a 49% completion rate, 6.8 yards per attempt. Alabama improved to 9-2 after that 34-zip home win to FCS Austin Peay behind 527 yards. Bryce Young on the season, 64% completion rate, 8.1 yards per attempt. At home, the Crimson Tide are moving the football for 485 yards and 6 yards per rush. This will open up plays for Young in the passing game. Tigers' passing game has performed poorly on the road. Crimson Tide does not hold anything back here because they're out of the SEC championship game. They play here at Alabama minus 22. Kansas versus Kansas State college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Kansas fell to 6-5 with their 55-14 home defeat to Texas. Jayhawks gained 346 yards in this one, 104 rushing on 30 carries. They surrendered nearly 7 yards per rush to the Longhorns with 112 passing on 22 attempts. Jalen Daniels completed 65% of his passes with 8.8 yards per attempt. He threw for 230 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. This year, Daniels a 66% completion rate with 9.1 yards per attempt. Kansas State moved to 8-3 with their 48-31 road win at West Virginia. Wildcats gained 437 yards in this one, 143 rushing on 42 attempts. Defensively, they allowed nearly 5 yards per run to the Mountaineers with 250 passing yards on 28 attempts. Will Howard hit on 70% of his passes with 10.9 yards per attempt. He passed for 294 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. On the season, Howard a 65% completion rate with 9.1 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Wildcats running for 3.9 yards per attempt. With Martinez' injury, their run production has decreased. Past 3 games, Jayhawks moving the football for 475 yards, 6.5 yards per rush, 8.6 yards per attempt. The play here will be Kansas, set plus the 12. Iowa State versus TCU college football pick Saturday. Iowa State fell to 4-7 after that 14-10 home defeat to Texas Tech. Cyclones gained 422 yards with 128 rushing on 43 carries. On defense, they held the Red Raiders to 3 yards per rush with 141 passing on 21 attempts. Hunter Deckers, 66% completion rate with 6.5 yards per attempt. He threw for 294 yards and a touchdown. On the year, Deckers a 67% completion rate, 6.8 yards per attempt. Deckers has 18 touchdowns and 13 interceptions. TCU improved to 11-0 after that 29-28 road win at Baylor. Horned Frogs gained 442 yards, 115 of it rushing on 27 carries. Defensively, they did allow 5 yards per carry to the Bears with 269 passing yards on 30 attempts. Max Duggan completed 68% of his passes, 9.3 yards per attempt. He passed for 327 yards, a touchdown with an interception. This season, Duggan a 66% completion rate, 9.3 yards per attempt. He's thrown for 26 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Horned Frogs' top 2 receivers and top running backs are banged up. Each listed as questionable. They took part in practice this week. Cyclones have covered 5 of their past 6 meetings against the Horned Frogs. Past 3 games, Iowa State holding teams to 230 yards, 2.5 yards per rush. The play here will be on Iowa State at plus 10. LSU versus Texas A&M college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. LSU sits at 9-2 with their 41-10 home win to UAB. Tigers gained 565 yards, 266 rushing on 41 carries. On defense, they held the Blazers at just over 2 yards per rush with 211 passing on 35 attempts. Jane Daniels completed 76% of his passes with 10.2 yards per attempt. He passed for 297 yards and a touchdown. This season, Daniels a 69% completion rate with 7.6 yards per attempt. He has rushed for 740 yards, 4.6 yards per carry. Texas A&M improved to 4-7 with a 20-3 home win to UMass. Aggies posted 404 yards with 213 rushing on 39 carries. On defense, they held the Minutemen to under 3 yards per rush with 55 passing on 23 attempts. Connor Wegman completed 58% of his passes with 10.1 yards per attempt. This season, Weigman a 53% completion rate with 6.5 yards per attempt. Both defenses in good form over the past 3 games. Weigman accuracy an issue for the 108th ranked scoring offense in the nation. The play here will be on LSU and Texas A&M under 47.5. Michigan versus Ohio State college football pick Saturday. Michigan improved at 11-0 with that 19-17 home win to Illinois. Wolverines gained 376 yards with 168 rushing on 40 carries. On defense, they allowed over 4 yards per rush to the Fighting Illini with 178 passing on 30 attempts. J.J. McCarthy completed 53% of his passes with 6.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 208 yards. This season, McCarthy a 67% completion rate, 7.9 yards per attempt. Ohio State sits at 11-0 after a 43-30 road win at Maryland. Buckeyes gained 401 yards with 160 rushing on 43 carries. On defense, they held the Terrapins to under 3 yards a carry with 318 passing on 37 attempts. C.J. Stroud completed 60% of his passes with 8 yards per rush. On the year, Stroud a 66% completion rate with 9.7 yards per attempt. Wolverines defense has allowed 17 or fewer points the past 7 games. They have covered 5 of 6 on the road. Past 3 games, Wolverines running for 5 yards per rush. The play here will be on Michigan plus 8.5. Notre Dame versus a USC college football pick Saturday. Notre Dame sits at 8-3 after their 44-0 home win to Boston College. Fighting Irish gained 437 yards, 281 rushing on 38 carries. Defensively, they held BC to under 2 yards per rush. Drew Pine completed 52% of his passes with 6.2 yards per attempt. He passed for 156 yards and a touchdown. This season, Pine a 62% completion rate with 7.5 yards per attempt. USC improved to 10-1 after their 48-45 road win at UCLA. Trojans produced 649 yards, 179 rushing on 38 carries. Defensively, they surrendered over 5 yards per run to the Bruins with 309 passing on 38 attempts. Caleb Williams, 74% completions in the game, 10.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 470 yards with 2 touchdowns and an interception. This year, Williams a 65% completion rate, 9 yards per pass attempt. Notre Dame has won 5 straight with a notable home win at Clemson by 21. Fighting Irish and Trojans over in 5 straight. Past 5 games, USC averaging 565 yards with 4.9 yards per rush, 10.1 yards per pass attempt. In this period, Notre Dame averaging 5.1 yards per rush, 8.1 yards per pass attempt. Trojans defense over this 3-game span, allowing 32 points a game to play here. Notre Dame and USC over 63. Oklahoma versus Texas Tech college football pick Saturday. Oklahoma improved to 6-5 with their 28-13 home win to Oklahoma State. Sooners gained 434 yards in this one with 175 rushing on 34 carries. Defensively, they held the Cowboys to 3 yards per rush with 381 passing yards on 43 attempts. Dylan Gabriel hit on 50% of his passes with 6.5 yards per pass. On the year, Gabriel a 62% completion rate with 8.2 yards per attempt. Texas Tech sits at 6-5, a 14-10 road win at Iowa State. Red Raiders put up 246 yards with 105 rushing on 38 attempts. Defensively, they held the Cyclones to 3 yards per rush with 294 passing on 36 attempts. Tyler Schell hit on 71% of his passes with 6.7 yards per attempt. He threw for 141 yards and a touchdown. On the season, Schell a 58% completion rate with 7.2 yards per attempt. Sooners have covered 4 of their past 5 head-to-head. Sooners offense past 5 games averaging 453 yards, 5.5 yards per attempt. Their defense in this game, over this period, is allowing opponents just 4.3 yards per rush, 5.8 yards per pass attempt. Red Raiders in this period allowing 4.8 yards per rush and 8.4 yards per pass attempt. The player will be Oklahoma here at -2. Oregon versus Oregon State college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Oregon improved to 9-2 with their 20-17 home win to Utah. Ducks produced 346 yards with 59 rushing on 25 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4.5 yards per rush. The Utes with 170 passing yards on 38 attempts. Bo Nix completed 67% of his passes with 7.8 yards per attempt. He passed for 287 yards, a touchdown plus interception. Nix ran it only twice, though. This year, Nix a 72% completion rate with 9.1 yards per attempt. Oregon State 8-3 after their 31-7 road win at Arizona State. Badgers gained 443 yards with 222 rushing on 42 carries. Defensively, they allowed 5 yards per run to ASU with 122 passing on 32 attempts. Ben Gulbranson completed 71% of his passes with 9 yards per attempt. He passed for 108 yards and a touchdown. On the season, Gulbranson, a 63% completion rate with 7.6 yards per attempt. Gulbranson, a massive upgrade at quarterback over the mistake-prone Chance Nolan. Nick's low rushing totals last week. I think it's a concern for the Ducks. Remember, that thigh may be an issue. At home, the Beavers are allowing 296 yards and only 3.2 yards per rush to play here. Oregon State +3. Tennessee versus Vanderbilt. College football pick here for Saturday. Tennessee fell to 9-2 with their defeat at South Carolina. Were pounded there in that game. Volunteers gained 507 yards with 152 rushing on 28 carries. On defense, they allowed 4 yards per run of the Gamecocks with 453 passing on 38 attempts. Joe Milton took over for an injured Hendon Hooker, hit on 50% of his passes with 13.5 yards per attempt. That 53-38 defeat. The Michigan transfer saw him up duty in 6 games with a 70% completion rate and 17.4 yards per attempt. He did pass for 6 touchdowns and no interceptions. Vanderbilt, well, they improved to 5-6 after their 31-24 home victory to Florida. Commodores gained 283 yards with 175 rushing on 46 attempts. Defensively, they held the Gators to 2 yards per rush with 400 passing on 43 attempts. Mike Wright completed 62% of his passes for 6.8 yards per attempt. He threw for 108 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. This season, Wright, a 58% completion rate with 7 yards per attempt. Commodores under in 4 or 5. Vols utilizing a backup quarterback, and Wright not accurate. The play here will be Tennessee and Vanderbilt under 64. Washington versus Washington State. College football pick Saturday. Washington improved to 9-2 with that 54-7 home win to Colorado. Huskies gained 575 yards with 280 rushing on 43 carries. Defensively, they held the Buffs to under 3 yards per attempt with 123 passing on 22 attempts. Michael Pennis completed 61% of his passes with 7.4 yards per attempt. He threw for 229 yards and a touchdown. This season, Penix a 67% completion rate with 8.5 yards per attempt. Washington State improved to 7-4 with that 31-20 road win at Arizona. Cougars produced 354 yards with 161 rushing on 37 attempts. Defensively, they held the Wildcats to nearly 4 yards per rush with 357 passing on 46 attempts. Cameron Ward completed 69% of his passes, 5.4 yards per attempt. He passed for 193 yards and a touchdown. On the year, Ward a 64% completion rate, 6.7 yards per attempt. Huskies on the road allowing 448 yards, 4.7 yards per rush, 270 passing, 8.6 yards per attempt. Offensively, they run for only 3.8 yards a carry on the highway. Washington defense in their road games allowing 57% conversions on 3rd down. Play here, Washington State +2. West Virginia versus Oklahoma State. College football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. West Virginia fell to 4-7 with that 48-31 home defeat to Kansas State. Mountaineers gained 369 yards with 153 rushing on 34 carries. Defensively, WVU allowed 3.5 yards per run to the Wildcats with 294 passing yards on 27 attempts. Garrett Green completed 55% of his passes with 7.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 204 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. On the year, Green a 55% completion rate with 7 yards per attempt. Oklahoma State fell to 7-4 with that 28-13 road defeat to Oklahoma. Cowboys gained 486 yards, 105 rushing on 35 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 5.5 yards per run to the Sooners with 259 passing yards on 40 attempts. Spencer Sanders completed 54% of his passes, 5.7 yards per attempt. He did throw for 381 yards, a touchdown, and 4 interceptions. This season, Sanders, a career low 57% completion rate, 7.2 yards per attempt. No bowl game for the Mountaineers, with head coach likely fired as his athletic director was let go last week. Double-digit road losses this year in the Big 12 at Iowa State, Texas Tech, and Texas for this Mountaineers team. At home, the Cowboys do move the football. West Virginia pass defense on the road has given up 408 yards, 282 passing, and 8.2 yards per attempt. At home, the Cowboys defense giving up 419 yards, 294 passing. To play here, West Virginia and Oklahoma State over 66.5. Wake Forest versus Duke college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Wake Forest improved to 7-4 with that 45-35 home win to Syracuse. Demon Deacons gained 543 yards with 212 rushing on 52 attempts. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per run to the Orange with 357 passing yards on 32 attempts. Sam Hartman completed about 70% of his passes with 7.7 yards per attempt. He passed for 331 yards and 4 touchdowns. On the year, Hartman career highs here, 63% completion rate, 8.8 yards per attempt. Duke sits at 7-4 with that 28-26 road defeat to the Pittsburgh Panthers. Blue Devils posted 353 yards, 63 rushing on 27 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 4 yards per rush with 190 passing on 32 attempts. They fumbled twice with one going for a Pittsburgh touchdown. Riley Leonard completed 53% of his passes with 6.4 yards per attempt. He passed for 290 yards and 3 touchdowns. On the year, Leonard, a 62% completion rate, 7.4 yards per attempt. At home, Duke moving the football for 453 yards, 5.5 yards per rush, 8.7 yards per attempt. Demon Deacons' run game generated only 2.7 yards per attempt on the road. Past 3 games, Demon Deacons' defense wearing out by giving up 338 yards passing with 9.3 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be Duke plus 3.5. Air Force and San Diego State college football pick. This one goes off Saturday. Air Force 8-3, a 24-12 home win to Colorado State. Falcons posted 359 yards in the game on 71 carries. Defensively, they allowed 3 yards per rush to CSU with 179 passing on 24 attempts. Zeke Daniels threw only 2 passes in the game. They were incomplete. He did rush for 24 yards and on 9 carries. This season, Daniels a 47% completion rate, 9.7 yards per attempt. He does average 5.2 yards per rush. San Diego State here 7-4 after their 34-10 row win at New Mexico. Aztecs gained 459 yards in the game, 177 rushing on 38 carries. They limited the Lobos to under 4 yards per rush with 112 passing on 23 attempts. Jalen Maiden completed 60% of his passes with 11.2 yards per attempt. He passed for 280 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. On the year, Maiden a 65% completion rate with 9.4 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Falcons defense allowing 187 yards, 2.3 yards per rush. They have allowed 19 or fewer points in 5 straight games. Play here, Air Force -2. Syracuse versus Boston College football pick. This one here on Saturday. Syracuse fell to 6-5 with that 45-35 road defeat to Wake Forest. 5 straight losses for the Orange. They posted 477 yards with 120 rushing on 29 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per run to the Demon Deacons with 331 passing on 43 carries. Garrett Schrader completed 55% of his passes with 10 yards per pass attempt. He passed for 324 yards with a touchdown and interception. On the year, Schrader a 63% completion rate with 8.5 yards per attempt. Boston College fell to 3-8 with their 44-0 road defeat to Notre Dame. Eagles gained 173 yards with 56 rushing on 36 carries. Emmett Moorhead completed 41% of his passes with 5.3 yards per attempt. He passed for 117 yards and 3 interceptions. BC 125th in the nation in scoring. Orange held Virginia, Pittsburgh, and NC State to low point totals. On the road, Syracuse averaging only 3.2 yards per rush. The Eagles 2.6 per rush at home. Play here, Syracuse and Boston College under 47. BYU and Stanford college football pick Saturday. BYU improved to 6-5 after that 52-26 home win to FCS school Utah Tech behind 676 yards. Used to be a Dixie College, we used to call them. Jaron Hall has completed 66% of his passes with 29 touchdowns, 6 picks, 8.4 yards per attempt. Stanford fell to 3-8 after their 27-20 road defeat to California. Cardinal put up 400 yards in this one, 129 rushing on 32 attempts. On defense, they surrendered over 5 yards per rush to the Golden Bears with 280 passing on 43 attempts. Tanner McKee completed 64% of his passes, 6 yards per attempt. He threw for 271 yards with a touchdown and interception. On the year, McKee a 60% completion rate, 6.8 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Cougars averaging 532 yards, 5.5 yards per rush, 325 passing with 9.6 yards per attempt. Their defense in that period surrendering 252 yards passing, 8 yards per attempt. McKee has shown the ability to move the Cardinal through the air. The play here, BYU and Stanford over 57.5. Louisville versus Kentucky college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Louisville improved to 7-4 with that 25-10 home win to NC State. Cardinals gained 345 yards, 192 of it rushing on 39 carries. Defensively, they held the Wolfpack to under 3 yards per rush with 214 passing yards on 42 attempts. Brock Doman completed 48% of his passes with 6.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 143 yards. Now on the season, Doman a 51% completion rate with 7.2 yards per attempt. Malek Cunningham had a shoulder injury and missed the game. Kentucky fell to 6-5 with their 16-6 home defeat to Georgia Bulldogs. Wildcats put up 295 yards with 89 rushing on 25 carries. Defensively, they allowed 5 yards per rush with 116 passing on 19 attempts. Will Levis completed 64% of his passes, 6.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 206 yards with a touchdown and interception. On the year, Levis a 66% completion rate, 8.4 yards per attempt. Louisville, four of their past 5 games have been at home for the Louisville Cardinals. Now they have a backup on the road facing a good Wildcats defense. On the road, the Cardinals are allowing 400 yards, 4.5 yards per rush, 8.3 yards per attempt. In the passing game, the play here will be on Kentucky minus 3.5. Memphis versus SMU college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Memphis sits at 6-5 with that 59-zip home win in FCS team North Alabama behind 493 yards. Now Seth Hennigan, the quarterback on the year, completing 64% of his passes with 8 yards per attempt. SMU, they dropped to 6-5 after a 59-24 road defeat at Tulane. Mustangs gained 470 yards in this one, 141 rushing on 44 carries. They surrendered over 7.5 yards per rush to the Green Wave with 141 passing on 14 attempts. Tanner Mordecai completed 65% in the loss, 6.1 yards per attempt. He passed for 298 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. On the air, Mordecai a 63% completion rate, 8.2 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Mustangs defense allowing 514 yards, 6.6 yards per rush, 8.5 yards per attempt. Tigers defense in this span allowing 253 yards. So the play here will be Memphis plus 4.5. Minnesota versus Wisconsin college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Minnesota is 7-4 after their 13-10 home defeat to Iowa. Golden Gophers gained 399 yards with 312 rushing on 50 carries. On defense, they allowed the Hawkeyes 2 yards per rush with 221 passing on 24 attempts. Tanner Morgan doubtful with that upper body injury. Ethan Kalakmanis completed 47% of his passes with 5.8 yards per attempt. He passed for 87 yards and an interception. On the air, Kalakmanis a 47% completion rate, 7.5 yards per attempt. A touchdown and 4 picks on the year. Wisconsin improved to 6-5 after that 15-14 come from behind road win at Nebraska. Badgers gained 318 yards, 235 rushing on 52 carries. Defensively, they allowed 2 yards per rush with 106 passing yards on 20 attempts. Graham Mertz completed a season low 44% with 4.6 yards per attempt. He passed for 83 yards, a touchdown, and 4.6 yards per attempt. This year, Mertz a 57% completion rate with 7.6 yards per attempt. And the Golden Gophers quarterback situation a concern, under trending on both sides and head-to-head. Badgers defense past 3 games allowing 169 yards and Golden Gophers 275. The play here, Minnesota and Wisconsin under 36. Pittsburgh versus Miami college football pick Saturday. Pittsburgh moved to 7-4 with their 28-26 home victory to Duke. Panthers produced 310 yards with 120 rushing on 33 carries. Defensively, they held the Blue Devils to under 3 yards per rush with 290 passing yards on 45 attempts. Keaton Slovis completed 47% of his passes with 5.9 yards per attempt. On the season, Slovis a 58% completion rate with 7.4 yards per attempt. Miami fell to 5-6 with their 40-10 road win at Clemson. Hurricanes gained just 98 yards with 30 rushing on 24 attempts. On defense, they allowed over 4 yards per run to the Tigers with 240 passing on 36 attempts. Tyler Van Dyke questionable with a shoulder injury. He has a 64% completion rate with 7.2 yards per attempt. He has missed 3 of his past 4 games. Ja'Carri Brown, his replacement, completed 46% of his passes with 4.1 yards per attempt in the game. He passed for 53 yards and an interception. On the year, Brown a 57% completion rate, 5.1 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Miami averaging 213 yards. Now, in this period, the Panthers defense allowing 214 yards, 1.1 yards per rush. Panthers offense in this span running for 3.6 yards per attempt. Slovis accuracy an issue as well. The play here, Pittsburgh and Miami under 43.5. Purdue versus Indiana college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Purdue improved to 7-4 with that 17-9 home win to Northwestern. Boilermakers gained 299 yards with 140 rushing on 42 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 4 yards per rush with 78 passing on 20 attempts. Aiden O'Connell completed 64% of his passes with 6.4 yards per attempt. He threw for 159 yards and 2 touchdowns. This season, O'Connell a 64% completion rate, 6.7 yards per attempt. Indiana improved to 4-7 after that 39-31 road overtime win to Michigan State Spartans. Hoosiers gained 288 yards, 257 of it rushing on 44 attempts. Defensively, Indiana allowed 5 yards per rush to the Spartans with nearly 300 passing yards on 42 attempts. Dexter Williams completed 28% of his passes, 4.4 yards per attempt. On the year, Williams a 32% completion rate, 4.8 yards per attempt. Indiana just one-dimensional right now running the football. On the road, the Boilermakers are holding teams to 336 yards, 3.5 yards per rush. Boilermakers are in the hunt for that Big Ten championship berth. The play here will be Purdue and Indiana under 55.5. Rutgers versus Maryland college football pick. This one is on Saturday. Rutgers fell to 4-7 with that 55-10 home defeat to Penn State. Scarlet Knights produced 176 yards, 41 rushing on 34 carries. Defensively, the Scarlet Knights allowed nearly 7 yards per rush to the Nittany Lions with 199 passing on 36 attempts. Gavin Wimsatt completed 34% of his passes with 4.2 yards per rush. He threw for 122 yards and a touchdown with a pick. This season, Wimsatt a 45% completion rate, 5.4 yards per attempt. Maryland fell at 6-5 with that 43-30 home defeat to Ohio State. Terrapins gained 402 yards, 84 rushing on 31 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per run to the Buckeyes with 241 passing on 30 attempts. Talia Tagovailoa completed 72% of his passes with 8.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 293 yards and 2 touchdowns. This year, Tagovailoa a 69% completion rate with 7.7 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Scarlet Knights at defense allowing 442 yards, 5.9 yards per rush. At home, the Terrapins moved the football well and on the ground and through the air. The play will be Maryland here at -14. Tulsa versus Houston college football pick Saturday. Tulsa improved to 4-7 with their 48-42 home win to USF. Golden Hurricane gained 573 yards with 271 rushing on 46 carries. On defense, they allowed 4.5 yards per rush to USF with 240 passing on 25 attempts. Braylon Braxton completed 74% of his passes with a season-high 11.2 yards per attempt. He passed for 302 yards and a touchdown in the game. On the year, Braxton a 56% completion rate with 6.8 yards per attempt. Now Houston, 7-4 team, a 42-3 road win at East Carolina. Cougars posted 515 yards with 80 rushing on 24 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 5 yards per rush to ECU, but only 197 passing on 35 attempts. Clayton Tune, 73% completion rate with 9.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 435 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. On the season, Tune a 69% completion rate with 8.2 yards per attempt. Cougars' offense has been blazing over the past 3 games, averaging 570 yards, 6.8 yards per rush, 417 passing with 9.1 yards per attempt. On defense, they're allowing 497 yards, 8.1 yards per attempt. The play here, Tulsa and Houston over 66.5. USF versus UCF college football pick. This one here on Saturday. UCF fell to 8-3 with that 17-14 home defeat to Navy. Knights gained 314 yards with 84 rushing on 24 carries. On defense, they surrendered 248 yards on 63 carries to Navy. Midshipman threw only 1 pass. John Plumlee completed 61% of his passes with 5.9 yards per attempt. He threw for 107 yards and an interception. On the season, Plumlee a 63% completion rate with 8 yards per attempt. USF 1-10 after their 48-42 road defeat to Tulsa. Bulls gained 499 yards, 259 rushing on 41 carries. On defense, they allowed over 5 yards per rush to the Golden Hurricane with 302 passing on 27 attempts. Byron Brown completed 84% of his passes with 9.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 240 yards and 3 touchdowns. On the year, Brown a 77% completion rate with 8.8 yards per attempt. Bulls' defensive form poor over the past 3 games by allowing 582 yards, 7 yards per rush, and 309 passing with 10 yards per attempt. They are moving the football for 450 yards in this period. Knights moving the football for 5 yards per rush as well over this period. The play here will be UCF and USF over 68.5. UTEP versus UTSA college football pick Saturday. UTEP improved to 5-6 with their 40-6 home win to FIU. Miners gained 525 yards in this one with 335 rushing on 61 attempts. On defense, they held FIU to under 1 yard per rush with 56 passing yards on 21 attempts. Gavin Hardison missed the game due to an injury. Calvin Braunholtz completed 67% of his passes for 10.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 190 yards, 2 touchdowns. This season, Braunholtz, 67% completion rate, 8.3 yards per attempt. UTSA 9-2 after their 41-7 road win at Rice. Roadrunners posted 394 yards with 262 rushing on 32 carries. Defensively, they held the Owls to 5 yards per rush on 32 carries, 225 passing on 42 attempts. Frank Harris, actually no, the Owls were held to just 5 yards total on 32 rushes, not 5 yards per attempt. They only gained 5 yards rushing on 32 carries. Imagine that. Pretty good defense there by UTSA. Now, Frank Harris completed 78% of his throws, 7.4 yards per attempt. He threw for 103 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. This season, Harris, 69% completion rate, 8.5 yards per attempt. But the Miners are defending well over their past 3 games, holding teams at 317 yards, and they are a win away from bowl eligibility. Braunholtz has put up some pretty good numbers in place of Hardison. The play here, UTEP plus 17.5. Western Kentucky versus FAU college football pick Saturday. Western Kentucky 7-5 with that 41-17 road defeat at Auburn. Hilltoppers gained 385 yards with 85 rushing on 29 carries. Defensively, WKU allowed over 6 yards per run to the Tigers with 122 passing yards on 20 attempts. Austin Reed completed season lows here, 47% with completions, 5.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 289 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. On the year, Reed a 65% completion rate with 7.7 yards per attempt. FAU 5-6 after their 49-21 road defeat at Middle Tennessee State. Owls posted 356 yards, 31 rushing on 32 carries. Defensively, FAU allowed under 4 yards per rush to the Blue Raiders with 448 passing on 54 attempts. N'Kosi Perry completed 53% of his passes, 9 yards per attempt. He passed for 325 yards and a touchdown. On the season, Perry a 56% completion rate with 7.3 yards per attempt. FAU needs the win for bowl eligibility, but the past 3 games, the Owls defense given up 455 yards, 5.7 yards per rush. Hilltoppers in this span averaging 492 yards, 4.9 yards per run, 379 in the passing game with 8.6 yards per attempt. The play here will be Western Kentucky and FAU over 61. Akron versus Northern Illinois college football pick. This one is on Saturday. Akron fell to 1-9 with their 34-28 home defeat to Eastern Michigan. Zips gained 386 yards with 163 rushing on 35 carries. Defensively, they held the Eagles to 4 yards per rush with 190 passing on 28 attempts. DJ Irons is questionable on the year. He is completing 67% of his passes with 6.9 yards per attempt in the loss to the Eagles. He completed 44%, 7 yards per pass attempt on the year. Under Cluffer came in here and may have to play for DJ Irons, and under Cluffer a 47% completion rate with 5 yards per attempt here. Northern Illinois 3-8 with their 29-23 home defeat to Miami, Ohio. Huskies gained 365 yards, 200 rushing on 32 carries. Defensively, they held the Red Hawks to 3.5 yards per rush, 185 passing on 23 attempts. Nevin Kremascali completed 63% of his passes, 7.5 yards per attempt. He passed for 165 yards and 2 touchdowns and a pick. On the year, Kremascali, 48% completion rate, 6.3 yards per attempt. You know, the Zips quarterback situation, a concern at home. NIU is running for nearly 5 yards a carry, while Akron's allowing 206 rushing yards with 5.2 yards per rush on the road. The play here will be Northern Illinois at -10. Appalachian State versus Georgia Southern. College football pick. This one is on Saturday. App State is 6-5 with their 27-14 home win to Old Dominion. Mountaineers gained 498 yards with 207 rushing on 42 carries. Defensively, they held ODU to 3 yards per rush with 308 passing on 38 attempts. Chase Bryce completed 68% of his passes with 13.2 yards per attempt. He threw for 291 yards and 2 touchdowns on the season. Bryce, a 63% completion rate with 8.3 yards per attempt. Georgia Southern is 5-6 after their 23-10 home defeat to Marshall. Eagles put up 384 yards with 179 rushing on 24 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 5 yards per rush to the Thundering Herd with 274 passing yards on 32 attempts. Kyle Van Treese completed 56% of his passes with 5.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 205 yards with a touchdown and interception. On the year, Van Treese a 61% completion rate with 6.9 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Eagles are allowing 493 yards, 5.5 yards per rush, 7.3 yards per pass attempt. 3 straight losses for Georgia Southern. The play here will be Appalachian State minus 4.5. Army versus Massachusetts college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Army improved to 4-6 with that 34-17 home win to Connecticut. Black Knights gained 323 yards, all rushing on 57 carries, no pass attempts. Tyler threw an incompletion but rushed for 70 yards and 2 touchdowns. This season, Tyler, a 41% completion rate, 14.7 yards per attempt. He is averaging 4.6 yards per run. Massachusetts dropped a 1-10, a 20-3 road defeat to Texas A&M. Minutemen gained 168 yards with 113 rushing on 41 carries. Defensively, they allowed 5.5 yards per rush to the Aggies with 191 passing on 19 attempts. Brady Olson completed 41% of his passes, 2.5 yards per attempt. On the year, Olson a 49% completion rate, 5 yards per attempt. Black Knights with the path to Boyle's ability with a win here and against Navy. Past 3 games, Minutemen allowing 5.7 yards per rush. And all Army does is run the football. The play here will be Army at minus 19.5. Coastal Carolina and James Madison college football pick for Saturday. Coastal Carolina 9-1 after a 26-23 home win to Southern Miss. Chanticleers gained 361 yards, 170 rushing on 42 carries. Defensively, they held the Golden Eagles to under 2 yards per rush with 313 passing on 30 attempts. Jared Guest completed 50% of his passes, but 11.6 yards per attempt. He passed for 163 yards and 2 interceptions. This season, Guest a 45% completion rate, but 10.2 yards per attempt, but 3 interceptions. James Madison improved here to 8-3, a 42-40 home win to Georgia State. Dukes gained 425 yards, 151 rushing on 45 carries. Defensively, they held the Panthers to under 3 yards per attempt with 176 passing on 15 attempts. They overcame 4 fumbles and a 20-point halftime deficit in victory. Todd Centillo completed 78% of his passes with 10 yards per attempt. He threw for 274 yards, 4 touchdowns on the season. Centillo a 65% completion rate, 9.6 yards per attempt. Dukes have failed to cover 4 of 5. 3 straight wins for the Chanticleers. The past 3 games, Coastal Carolina allowing 2.5 yards per rush and 4 quarterback sacks. The play here will be Coastal Carolina plus the 14. East Carolina versus Temple college football pick. This one is on Saturday. East Carolina is 6-5 with their 42-3 home defeat to Houston Cougars. Pirates gained 315 yards with 118 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, ECU allowed over 3 yards per rush to the Cougars with 435 passing yards on 44 attempts. Holden Ehlers completed season lows here, 50%, 6.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 182 yards. This season, Ehlers a 67% completion rate with 7.9 yards per attempt. Temple fell to 3-8 with their 23-3 home defeat to Cincinnati. Owls gained 202 yards with 35 rushing on 19 carries. On defense, Temple allowed over 3 yards per rush to the Bearcats with 257 passing yards on 35 attempts. E.J. Warner completed 58% of his passes with 4.6 yards per attempt. He passed for 167 yards and 2 interceptions. Pirates need a win for Boyle eligibility, and the Owls are out of the postseason contention. But past 3 games, Pirates defense allowing 404 yards with 8.2 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be Temple plus 13. Georgia State and Marshall college football pick. This one here on Saturday. Georgia State falls to 4-7 with that 42-40 road defeat at James Madison. Panthers gained 257 yards with 81 rushing on 35 carries. On defense, they allowed 3 yards per run to the Dukes with 274 passing yards on 27 attempts. Panthers blew a 20-point halftime lead and a +2 turnover margin. Darren Granger completed 53% of his passes for about 12 yards per attempt. He threw for 176 yards and a touchdown. On the year, Granger a 57% completion rate with 7.9 yards per attempt. Marshall improved to 7-4, a 23-10 road win at Georgia Southern. Thundering Herd posted 529 yards, 255 rushing on 54 carries. Defensively, they did allow 7 yards per rush with 205 passing on 40 attempts. Cam Fancher completed 53% of his passes, 8.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 274 yards and 2 touchdowns. Thundering Herd at home holding teams to 232 yards, 2.5 yards per rush, 5.5 yards per pass attempt. On offense, they do move the football for 411 yards. Tough losses to JMU for the Panthers. Not only did they blow a big lead, but they lost a chance at bowl eligibility. Play here will be Marshall -6. Georgia Tech versus Georgia college football pick Saturday. Georgia Tech improved to 5-6 with their 21-17 road win at North Carolina. Yellow Jackets gained 379 yards with 192 rushing on 46 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 5 yards per run to the Tar Heels with 202 passing on 30 attempts. Zach Gibson completed 72% of his passes with 9.7 yards per attempt. He threw for 174 yards. On the year, Gibson a 55% completion rate with 5.8 yards per attempt. Georgia improved to 11-0 after their 16-6 road win at Kentucky. Bulldogs posted 365 yards with 249 rushing on 44 carries. Defensively, Georgia held the Wildcats to over 3 yards per carry, 206 passing on 31 attempts. Stetson Bennett completed 68% of his passes, 6.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 116 yards and an interception. On the year, Bennett a 68% completion rate with 8.7 yards per attempt. Yellow Jackets have shown improvement offensively down the stretch, but face a strong defense here. On the road, Yellow Jackets are giving up 411 yards, 4.6 yards per rush. The play here will be Georgia -35. Hawaii versus San Jose State college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Hawaii improved to 3-9 with their 31-25 home win to UNLV. Warriors gained 369 yards in this one with 167 rushing on 36 attempts. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per run to the Rebels with 288 passing yards on 37 attempts. Braden Shager completed 59% of his passes with 7.5 yards per attempt. He passed for 202 yards and 3 touchdowns. On the year, Shager a 55% completion rate with 6 yards per attempt. San Jose State fell to 6-4 after their 35-31 road defeat to Utah State. Spartans produced 341 yards with 84 rushing on 28 attempts. Defensively, they allowed 3.5 yards per run to the Aggies with 244 passing on 35 attempts. Spartans did allow special team touchdown. Shavon Cordero completed 67% of his passes with 8.6 yards per attempt. He threw for 257 yards and 4 touchdowns. This year, Cordero a 60% completion rate with 7.5 yards per attempt. Warriors on the road giving up 480 yards, 6.1 yards per attempt, 9.7 yards per pass attempt. Spartans are bowl eligible, but the 6-win Mountain West teams, they're not guaranteed anything. They really need 7 wins to get in the bowl. 6 wins, well, you do have a shot to get in, but it's never guaranteed. The player will be San Jose State here at -15. Illinois versus Northwestern college football pick for Saturday. Illinois fell to 7-4 after their 19-17 road defeat to Michigan. Final Illini gained 326 yards with 148 rushing on 34 attempts. Defensively, they allowed 4 yards per rush to the Wolverines with 208 passing on 34 attempts. Tommy DeVito completed 70% of his throws, 5.9 yards per attempt. On the season, DeVito a 70% completion rate with 7.1 yards per attempt. Northwestern, they sit at 1-10 after their 17-9 road defeat to Purdue. Wildcats offense gained 240 yards, 162 rushing on 45 carries. Defensively, they allowed 3.5 yards per rush to the Boilermakers with 159 passing on 25 attempts. Cole Freeman completed 45% of his throws, 3.9 yards per attempt. He passed for 78 yards and an interception. On the year, Freeman a 43% completion rate with 3.7 yards per attempt. Freeman is a 4th-string quarterback with injuries to Sullivan and Helinski, plus 3rd-stringer Richardson has been ineffective. Wildcats will have trouble scoring here. Northwestern defense has played well this season. Play here, Illinois and Northwestern under 38. Kent versus Buffalo, college football pick. This one is on Saturday. Kent fell to 4-7 with their 31-24 home defeat to Eastern Michigan. Golden Flashes gained 357 yards with 116 rushing on 33 carries. Defensively, they allowed over 3 yards per rush to EMU with 315 passing on 40 attempts. Colin Schlee completed 50% of his passes in defeat with 12.5 yards per attempt. He threw for 150 yards and a touchdown. This year, Schlee completed 59% of his passes with 8 yards per attempt. Buffalo is 5-5 with that 31-27 road defeat at Central Michigan. Bulls gained 431 yards with 240 rushing on 57 attempts. Defensively, they surrendered about 8 yards per rush to the Chippewas with 117 passing on 17 attempts. Cole Snyder completed 59% of his passes, 6 yards per attempt. He threw for 191 yards and an interception. This season, Snyder a 59% completion rate with 6.7 yards per attempt. Golden Flash is out of bowl consideration. Buffalo needs one win to become bowl eligible. A decision about making up that Akron game will be later in the week. It's always tough to win in Buffalo for MAC teams. On the road, Golden Flashes are allowing 450 yards, 274 passing with 8.9 yards per attempt. The play here will be Buffalo -4. Louisiana versus Texas State, college football pick Saturday. Louisiana fell to 5-6 with that 49-17 road defeat to Florida State. Raging Cajuns gained 291 yards with 132 rushing on 32 carries. Defensively, they did surrender over 5 yards per rush to the Seminoles with 189 passing on 21 attempts. Chandler Fields completed 53% of his passes with 4.4 yards per attempt. He passed for 159 yards and a touchdown on the year. Fields a 56% completion rate with 5.9 yards per attempt. Texas State improved to 4-7 with that 16-13 home win to Arkansas State. Bobcats gained 340 yards, 144 rushing on 38 carries. Defensively, they limited the Red Wolves to 2 yards per rush with 237 passing on 40 attempts. Lane Hatcher completed 64% of his passes with 5.4 yards per attempt. He threw for 196 yards on the season. Hatcher a 63% completion rate with 6.1 yards per attempt. Raging Cajuns needs a win to become bowl eligible, but Fields is a backup making his second start after their starters out. Raging Cajuns road form not impressive. Past 3 games, Bobcats holding teams at 2.5 yards per rush, and Louisiana averaging 4.8 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be Texas State at +5. Middle Tennessee State versus FIU, college football pick. This one is on Saturday. Middle Tennessee State moved to 6-5 with that 49-21 home win to FAU. Blue Raiders gained 615 yards with 167 rushing on 36 carries. Defensively, they held the Owls to 1 yard per rush with 325 passing on 37 attempts. Chase Cunningham completed 74% of his passes with 8.3 yards per attempt. He threw for 448 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 1 interception. This season, Cunningham a 67% completion rate with 7 yards per attempt. FIU fell to 4-7 with that 40-6 road defeat to UTEP. Golden Panthers gained 71 yards with 115 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, they allowed 6 yards per rush to UTEP with 190 passing on 18 attempts. Grayson James completed 37% of his passes with 3.5 yards per attempt. He threw for 56 yards and an interception. This year, James a 58% completion rate with 5.5 yards per attempt. FIU offense has floundered, averaging just 202 yards over the past 3 games. Grayson's past 2 games, he's completed only 36% of his passes, 2.7 yards per attempt. The play here, Middle Tennessee State at -19.5. Nevada versus UNLV, college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Nevada drops to 2-9 with their 41-14 home defeat to Fresno State. Wolfpack posted 389 yards with 146 rushing on 30 carries. Defensively, they surrendered 5 yards per rush to the Bulldogs with 361 passing on 42 attempts. Nate Cox completed 42% of his passes with 6.4 yards per attempt. He threw for 243 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. This season, Cox a 51% completion rate with 5.7 yards per attempt. UNLV fell to 4-7 after their 31-25 road defeat to Hawaii. Rebels gained 427 yards with 139 rushing on 36 carries. Defensively, they allowed 5 yards per rush to the Warriors with 202 passing yards on 27 attempts. Doug Brumfield hit on 62% of his passes with 7.8 yards per attempt. He passed for 288 yards, a touchdown, and interception. On the season, Brumfield a 65% completion rate with 7.5 yards per attempt. Wolfpack have lost 9 straight, covering just 1 in that period. At home, the Rebels are moving the football for 411 yards, 5.2 yards per rush. Nevada on the road averaging only 244 yards to play here. UNLV minus 12. New Mexico State and Liberty college football pick Saturday. New Mexico State fell to 4-6 with that 45-14 road defeat at Missouri. Aggies posted 259 yards in this game, 144 rushing on 40 carries. Defensively, they allowed 4.5 yards per rush to the Tigers with 261 passing yards on 31 attempts. Diego Pavia completed in this one 35%, 4.5 yards per attempt. He passed for 76 yards and an interception. Now 5.9 yards per attempt he also had for the season with 46% completion rate for 2022. Now Liberty, they fell to 8-3, a 23-22 home defeat to Virginia Tech. Flames gained 332 yards with 115 rushing on 29 carries. Defensively, they surrendered 3 yards per rush to the Hokies with 148 passing on 20 attempts. Jonathan Bennett completed 53% of his passes with 6.5 yards per attempt. He passed for 98 yards now on the year. Bennett a 58% completion rate with 7 yards per attempt. Aggies defense on the road giving up 418 yards, 5.2 yards per rush, 8.1 yards per attempt. Liberty defensively strong at home, holding opponents at 316 yards, 16 points a game. They're averaging 4 point sacks at home. The play will be Liberty minus 23.5. Old Dominion versus South Alabama college football pick. This one goes off here on Saturday. Old Dominion fell to 3-8 with that 27-14 defeat at Appalachian State. Monarchs gained 394 yards with 86 rushing on 28 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 5 yards per run to the Mountaineers with 291 passing on 22 attempts. Hayden Wolf completed 58% of his passes with 8.1 yards per attempt. He threw for 308 yards, 2 touchdowns. Now this season, Wolf a 56% completion rate with 7 yards per attempt. South Alabama 9-2 after their 27-20 road win at Southern Miss. Jaguars gained 411 yards with 154 rushing on 35 carries. Defensively, they held the Golden Eagles to 3 yards per run with 196 passing on 34 attempts. Carter Bradley completed 68% of his passes with 11 yards per attempt. He threw for 238 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. This year, Carter a 64% completion rate with 8.1 yards per attempt. 5 straight losses for ODU with offensive struggles. Past 3 games, Monarchs averaging 276 yards, 5.7 yards per attempt. In this period, surrendering 459 yards, 25 points per game. Jaguars have struggled to get just enough, struggled really to separate from teams to cover games. South Alabama in this period averaging 10 penalties for 97 yards in this 3-game period. The play here will be Old Dominion plus 16.5. Rice versus North Texas college football pick. This one is on Saturday. Rice fell to 5-6 with that 41-7 home defeat to UTSA. Owls gained 230 yards with 5 yards rushing on 32 carries. Defensively, they allowed 8.5 yards per rush to the Roadrunners with 132 passing on 23 attempts. 4-string QB Shaki Itraish completed 47% of his passes with 4.7 yards per attempt. He threw for 89 yards and an interception. They had to pull Wiley Green quickly in this one. TJ McMahon on the year has a 60% completion rate with 7.9 yards per attempt. Now North Texas fell to 6-5 with their 41-21 road defeat to UAB. Mean Green gained 264 yards with 105 rushing on 29 carries. On defense, they limited their opponent here, UAB, to nearly 5.5 allowed, I should say, UAB to 5.5 yards per rush on the ground, with 234 passing on 23 attempts. Asanani completed season lows here, 47% with pass completions here with 5 yards per attempt. He passed for 159 yards and a touchdown. On the year, Ani a 57% completion rate, 9.1 yards per attempt. So he does make big plays downfield. But Rice needs a win for bowl eligibility. 6-win teams are not guaranteed a bowl berth, especially in conferences like Conference USA. 7 wins means the Mean Green are in. Rice quarterback situation is a mess. Past 3 games, Owls allowing 401 yards with nearly 6 yards per carry on the ground and 8 yards per pass attempt. The play here will be North Texas minus 13.5. Southern Miss versus UL Monroe college football pick Saturday. Southern Miss enters at 5-6 with their 27-20 home defeat to South Alabama. Golden Eagles posted 298 yards with 102 rushing on 33 carries. On defense, they held the Jaguars to under 3 yards per rush with 257 passing yards on 26 attempts. Trey Lowe completed 54% of his passes with 5.1 yards per attempt. He passed for 167 yards and an interception. This year, Lowe a 52% completion rate with 7.3 yards per attempt. UL Monroe is 4-7 after their 34-16 road defeat at Troy. Warhawks gained 228 yards with 83 rushing on 33 carries. On defense, they surrendered nearly 6 yards per rush to the Trojans with 78 passing yards on 17 attempts. Chandler Rogers completed 61% of his throws with a season-low 5.2 yards per attempt in defeat. He passed for 145 yards. This season, Rogers a 68% completion rate with 7.8 yards per attempt. Golden Eagles a win away from bowl eligibility. USM has covered 6 of 7 on the road. Both offensive. This is the past 3 games are struggling. Golden Eagles running for just 2.1 yards per rush. Warhawks 2.5 over that 3-game span. Southern Miss quarterback situation also a concern. The play here, Southern Miss and UL Monroe under 50.5. Troy versus Arkansas State college football pick. This one here is on Saturday. Troy improved to 9-2 with their 34-16 home win at UL Monroe. Trojans gained 342 yards, 264 rushing on 42 carries. Defensively, they held the Warhawks to under 3 yards per rush with 145 passing on 28 attempts. Gunnar Watson, 59% completions here with a season low 4.6 yards per attempt. He passed for 78 yards. Now this season, Watson a 61% completion rate, 8 yards per attempt. Arkansas State 3-8 with that 16-13 road defeat to Texas State. Red Wolves gained 291 yards, 54 on the ground on 23 carries. Defensively, they held the Bobcats at 3.5 yards per rush, 196 passing on 37 attempts. Now James Blackman completed 55% in the game, 6 yards per attempt. He had passed for 237 yards and a touchdown. This year, Blackman a 65% completion rate, 7.2 yards per attempt. Past 3 games, Red Wolves averaging 241 yards, 2.5 yards per rush, 5.7 yards per attempt. A win in Troy is in the Sun Belt title game. The play here will be Troy minus 13.5. UAB versus Louisiana Tech college football pick Saturday. UAB fell to 5-6 with that 41-10 road defeat to LSU. Blazers posted 259 yards with 48 rushing on 22 carries. Defensively, they surrendered 6 yards per rush to the Tigers with 299 passing on 31 attempts. Dylan Hopkins completed season lows here, 48%, 5.4 yards per attempt. He passed for 158 yards. Now this year, Hopkins a 64% completion rate, 9.2 yards per attempt. Louisiana Tech 3-8 after their 36-21 road win at Charlotte. Bulldogs posted 350 yards, 137 rushing on 36 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 5 yards per rush to the 49ers with 268 passing yards on 30 attempts. Landry Liddy completed 74% of his throws, 6.9 yards per attempt. He passed for 213 yards and 2 interceptions. This season, Liddy a 67% completion rate with 6.3 yards per attempt. Blazers with a win bowl eligible. Blazers have failed to cover 5 straight on the road and back-to-back road spot here at home. Louisiana Tech does move the football for 428 yards, 4.6 yards per rush, 7.9 yards per pass attempt. The play here at Louisiana Tech at plus 17.5. Utah versus Colorado college football pick Saturday. Utah fell to 8-3 with their 20-17 road defeat at Oregon. Utes gained 326 yards, 156 of it rushing on 36 attempts. On defense, they held the Ducks to just over 2 yards per rush with 287 passing yards on 37 attempts. Cameron Rising completed 55% of his passes with a season-low 4.5 yards per attempt. He passed for 170 yards and 3 interceptions. On the year, Rising a 65% completion rate with 7.7 yards per attempt. Colorado fell to 1-10 after a 54-7 road defeat at Washington. Buffs gained 202 yards, 79 of it rushing on 33 carries. Defensively, they allowed nearly 7 yards per rush to the Huskies with 295 passing on 38 attempts. Tay-Chi Shrout completed 33% of his passes with 6.7 yards per attempt. He threw 420 yards, a touchdown, and a reception. This year, Shrout here a 44% completion rate with 6 yards per attempt. You know, a 3-game tie in the Pac-12 conference here for second place between Utah, Washington, and Oregon will send the Utes to the Pac-12 title game in a Rose Bowl berth. So what they need to happen is they need UCLA to beat Cal. They also need Oregon and Washington lose. And if they win the tiebreaker for second place in the Pac-12. So there is a path for Utah to get to the Rose Bowl. And that is to win and hope UCLA wins and hope Washington State upsets Washington and hope Oregon State upsets Oregon. So there are your scenarios there. Play here will be Utah minus 29.5.